our two people representing the voices of the sort of the business community are not able to participate. So the three non-business people here will fudge it a little bit, and but I think there's enough insight here to still make this thing sing. Before we get going, I want to introduce who will be presenting with me. First is Dan Beck, who's with Holmes Culley. He's a principal there and has 15 years experience in retrofitting existing structures, historic buildings, and public projects. His areas of expertise include nonlinear analysis and performance-based engineering. He's completed over 40 nonlinear time history projects, both in the United States and New Zealand, with a number of those being historic projects. Susan McComb has 25 years experience designing and planning a diverse group of university, mixed-use, historic renovation, and adaptive reuse projects. Since joining BAR in 1989, she has worked on a variety of projects throughout the United States and internationally. And my name is Joseph Haney. I'm a partner at Haney Labriola. I am a real estate attorney whose practice includes a significant amount of historic preservation, adaptive reuse, and with hotels. So excited to do this presentation. The format we're going to do is we're going to start actually with the beautiful pictures that Susan and Dan have, sort of to whet the appetite, showing some examples of the challenges that they have faced in the design side of this. And then having established that, then we're going to go to sort of a pre-developed list of questions that we've run through. And then, as John said, open it up to questions from the audience. So I'm going to hand it over actually now to Susan and Dan to start their portion of the presentation.
Thanks so much, Joseph. This is Susan, and I will get us rolling here. What we wanted to do is just present you with some concepts and ideas to start a conversation. So our hope is that you will participate with us as we move through this. My remarks for this seminar are not about setting forth kind of firm principles or case studies regarding means and methods, but it's more of a conversation about possibilities and highlighting issues for creative resolution. And I'd like to draw your attention to this word adaptation, because in this case, the term adaptation is not so much of a technical construction term, but more of a biological and evolutionary one, meaning that our historic preservation specifications use a lot of language that's refinish, repurpose, remove, restore, construct, that have very specific meanings. And in the examples of office conversions into a hotel, one actually ends up with a whole new architecture. So it's adapted and evolved from where it started from the beginning. The characteristics of former use remodeled into altered functions. And it's just an example of us adapting our fabric and our urban environment to uses. So one of the creative moves in putting hotel functions into an office building is not purely preservationist in nature. And so watch for that in these examples so that we can talk about those, because those are the issues that we have to creatively evolve as we go along. So to begin this conversation, why convert an office building, and why are we doing that now? Well, the biggest reason is, I think, location and availability. And now, putting on my developer hat, I'll point out to you that a lot of these historic office buildings, the ones that we find very attractive and now are historic landmarks, are in the center of cities, and cities are going a revival. A lot of these downtown core areas were blighted at one point, but now they're drawing a certain amount of attention, and these places are now available. So we're rediscovering these buildings. At the same time, the historic office building, especially the ones done at the turn of the century, are no longer the same Class A office building that they once were, and so they're seeing a lot of competition with newer versions of office buildings. And so they're ripe for kind of a repurpose. In the example that you see here, the blue square is 1095 Market Street. The diagonal street there is Market in San Francisco. I think you can actually use a cursor. Right here. And it's across from Civic Center. So at one time, it was in the prime location for an office building before the 1906 earthquake. It survived the 1906 earthquake. It retained its position there. This is where it shows it in the middle of some very, very early fabric next to some other civic buildings. So, you know, at that time, it was the tallest thing around. So over time, this area of the city has suffered, you know, I would say that the energy of the city has gone to the financial district or South Market, but now this central market area is enjoying a resurgence. Some attention is being paid to this building, although it's been vacant since for the last 7 years or so, and it's kind of fallen out of favor for an office building type. It's really drawn some good recent attention. Let's go to the next slide. Oops. Sorry.
Yeah.
It's a little slow, folks, so just give us a second. So let's talk about the historic office buildings, the ones that are turn of the century. They were state-of-the-art at the time they were built. They had some really interesting structural techniques in them. They have narrow footprints because daylight was important to get into those offices. The offices were all typically single offices interconnected, double loaded around a single office core. They had operable windows, regular structural bays. They often had a really beautiful decorative open connecting staircase that went all the way through that was open to all the corridors, and they had a combination of structural systems. So lo and behold, they happen to be, give me a second here, the same sort of footprint that you might see in a modern hotel room. So which way am I going?
We're waiting for the slideshow to pick
Yeah.
up, guys.
There we go. So this was the Wainwright building that underneath, and a typical, I think it's a Hilton laid over the top. So you can see it's almost the same width of footprint. Again, operable windows, again, double loaded corridor, a single connecting core. So in some ways, these historic office buildings were really set up to become modern hotel buildings at some point. Furthermore, in the development of, I'll just give it a minute, I'll talk over the transition. The other thing that's happened since these historic office buildings have been put into place is that the preservation movement has come a long way over the last 50 years in working with the regulatory community and tax credit community to allow conversion of use to be something that is actually really doable and possible. It's something that building officials now understand, and so that converting a certain type of building to another building is well developed in a regulatory framework. Sorry, technical, oh, there we go, okay. So this is a floor plan of 1095 Market, and the gray area is the existing brick historic walls, as well as some of the new structure put inside of it. It had a light well on the northeast side of the project, and you can see that putting in it, while maintaining the double-loaded corridor configuration and the decorative historic stair, we can get a certain amount of hotel rooms in there. And it's been observed, this is a really great example of seeing that hotel functions put into existing structures is largely a game of Tetris or sliding puzzles, and if you like those as a kid, you'll really love this exercise. Because in essence, a hotel is a package of furniture and fixtures that need to be placed in specific relationships with each other, at the same time while dodging the physical aspects that need to stay in place. So you can see, for example, while the module of the room is consistent and it has to, that as it hits the existing windows, that the demising walls have to jog. You have to work with your operator to change the configuration of the room a little bit. You may be tweaking the furniture package some, but as a whole, it fits pretty nicely into the footprint. The test just takes 3. Another key, there it is. Okay, so there's like, this shows the demising walls on the outside and where we have to hit the existing mullions of the existing, we're keeping the existing windows in this case, another great feature of the historic buildings. But we want our demising walls to not be in front of those windows, so they have to jog in specific ways. At the same time, we have to dodge the existing structure and work plumbing around that. So it's really an exercise in getting this all to fit. Another key characteristic of historic office buildings that aligns nicely with modern urban hotels is the public aspect of the ground floor. On the lower left-hand side, you'll see what's an image from a Sanborn insurance map from, let's see, this was, 1920, I think this is a 1929 map. Even though it says built 1929 on this plan, this building was built in 1904, probably occupied in 05, destroyed again in 06, rebuilt in 07. But you can see that it had a large open space on the ground floor where they originally had a bank. It had this really tall ground floor, and many of these historic buildings were constructed with this large ground floor where you could deliberately support in either a storage mezzanine or an office mezzanine. And that mezzanine shown on the upper two images as this kind of slick, dare I say slick, contemporary insert into the raw bones of the building is now a place that can be the business center of the hotel, it can be administrative offices, and that leaves the ground floor open for public amenity. Retail, restaurants, things that enliven the streetscape. And in that lower, you'll see that in the lower right-hand image where they put a bar into this large open space, leaving the space raw, which is the current, that's the current kind of aesthetic sensibility right now, refinement in the rough. And we can debate that as from a preservationist standpoint as well, but it's certainly something that historic office buildings offer this modern hotel. So finally, one of the things that works with an historic building and a new modern hotel is one of the most critical elements of a hotel, as you can imagine, is the simplest, most common sense one, is you have to have a good night's sleep. You know, if nothing else is satisfied, your guest has to sleep well and has to wake up refreshed. And what's interesting about historic office buildings compared to modern hotel buildings is the floor-to-floor heights are typically taller. So for example, the historic building, 1095 Market, has a variety of different floor heights. Oddly, not one single floor is the same as the other floor. And they range from, I'll have to ask Dan again, but it's like 1510 to 12.8 or something to that end.
12.9 to 12.10.
To 12.10 to, yeah, and back and forth, which makes putting in new stairs interesting, but at the same time, it gives a unique perspective on the guest room. Now I'm going to put a slide again. So note to self, it takes like.
Yeah, that takes a few minutes.
Okay, so. So let's dwell on this. We'll move back to the previous image again. What the modern hotel now has really evolved in its ability to provide a very interesting guest room. All of which, as we learn about sleep over time, you all have probably noticed how sleep has become kind of the next wellness discussion. We know that every human has unique patterns, and at the same time, technologies for adapting historic systems have advanced so that these office buildings can really give you a good night's sleep. We can have store windows that allow us to keep historic single pane windows while improving acoustics. We've got filtered air that can be delivered directly to the control of the guest. And there's a widespread acceptance for lofted configurations that allows hoteliers to break the room mold and work with these taller ceiling heights that an historic building has to offer. So on the right-hand side, you see a variety of different sleeping arrangements that are being used in these modern hotels and these contemporary hotels that can be adapted to fit these taller floor heights. Well, so what does all this mean, repurposing historic offices into hotels? Well, the key here that I would like to leave you with, which is the larger urbanist perspective, is that it allows new ways for cities to be hospitable and comfortable and for a variety of strangers in every shape, size, price point, and mobility. And so from a larger preservationist sense, reusing every nook and cranny of our built environment is really the essence of a creative, sustainable environment. So this repurpose of historic offices is allowing something that was an underused resource to become a very relevant and current resource. And most importantly, it occupies an historic structure that might not otherwise be occupied, and thus will be kept and maintained, a very sustainable move. So with those kind of bigger philosophical musings, we're now going to move on to a more structured part of the conversation with Dan Beck, who has been working with VAR architects on a variety of different historic buildings, all of that are almost universally were built for one purpose and is now becoming a different purpose. So he's used to this creative effort of us coming in and saying, Dan, what can we do with this building?
Sure. Thanks, Susan. What I'd like to start with is just the structural design process that we like to use in this when we approach a historic building. First of all, we need to investigate what we have. A lot of times with a historic building, we are working with buildings that have archaic materials for which we do not know what the material strengths are, such as concrete strengths or brick shear strength values. Also, we frequently find that the buildings that we're researching, we do not have the structural plans for the building. So we'll have to do some exploratory work to find out just what the structural system of the building is. Is it concrete encased steel, or is it a concrete frame building? Just simple questions like that. The next thing that we need to really truly understand is what are the historic features of the building that we're trying to protect. Sorry guys, we're having some slideshow difficulties here. Let's see if I can go back. There we go. What are the historic features that we're trying to protect? What are the strengths of the existing historic structural system? What are the weaknesses that we need to augment and improve? Once we have investigated and quantified these various aspects of the buildings, then it comes time to analyze the building and how you analyze the building, what choices that you make there. You can select the state historic building code. There's certain benefits to doing that, or you can do a performance-based engineering approach to the structural design, which can be extremely beneficial for historic buildings because you get to use some of the archaic materials that I talked about previously, which are now not codified and you would not be permitted to use. The defining aspect of your structural approach to a historic building is to make sure that you augment the existing structural system and you don't simply replace it with something new. Just because something is historic and it's no longer considered code conforming anymore does not mean that it doesn't work. You have to realize that these structures have been here sometimes for more than 100 years, and we just have to be able to quantify what they are good for and to augment those weaknesses. Give me a moment here while I wait for the slide to transition. There we go. This is a pretty familiar floor plate here. This is 1095 Market Street, which we've worked with BAR on. This is a particularly challenging project from a number of different aspects. One, it's a pretty small floor plate. I think it's about 7,500 square feet per floor. One aspect of the building was that we had to provide code-conforming stairs, right?
Code-conforming stairs.
And we had this beautiful historic stair, which we would have had to enclose in order to use. So what we did manage to come up with an idea of putting some stairwells, code-conforming eco stairs, in the light well back of the building. It was a great opportunity. It was on a non-historic portion of the project. So we were able to find, what are the historic defining features of this building, and fundamentally it came down to protecting the facades of the building along Stevenson, 7th Street, and Market Street, and that this light well on the back of the building was not found to be historic. So there were some opportunities there that we were able to capitalize on. The next aspect of this particular project is that we were repurposing the building into a hotel use, which meant that there was a change in occupancy and substantial change to the structure, which triggered a seismic retrofit. A lot of times when you do seismic retrofits in buildings, you end up putting in big, ugly braces in front of windows on storefronts, and obviously that doesn't, I mean, it might protect the historic building, but it doesn't necessarily showcase the historic building or protect it in a way that's sensitive to the historic features. So let me see if I can go to the next slide. The retrofit that we developed for this building needed to rely on some lateral elements. In this case, these green lines represent concrete shear walls, which we inserted into the building, T-shaped shear walls, which were pulled away from all of the facades, or the historic facades. In order to realize this type of retrofit, what we needed to have is we needed to have strong floor diaphragms. The floors needed to be able to drag the inertial loads from the seismic event back to these shear walls. So it really needed to have a strong diaphragm. During the materials investigation phase of the project, early on, we had discovered that the floors in this particular building actually happened to be really weak. The concrete in the building had a compressive strength of about 600 psi, which is really low when we consider low strength concrete to be something around 2,000 psi, and typically we'd expect to see 3,000 or 4,000 psi concrete in a concrete floor. So it was it immediately became apparent that we were going to have to strengthen the floors of this building in order to be able to realize this configuration for the retrofit, so that we could protect those facades. And to add fuel to the fire, the building was being repurposed into a hotel, which typically means we have lots of floor penetrations through floors that are already weak.
In a regular pattern.
So it was quite challenging. So this building had a Roebling fireproof floor construction. Roebling is a fireproof floor system that was patented by Roebling company back in the early 1900s, late 1800s, and essentially the structural system is as shown here. You have concrete encased steel beams with a concrete slab that spans between the steel beams, and they have flat strap reinforcing that's wrapped around the top flange of the beams. And then on top of that, they had a wood sleeper and cinder system and wood floor, and then a plaster ceiling. And this formed the fireproof floor system. And it actually worked quite well, because the building survived the 1906 earthquake and fire, mainly the fire. It could have done better from a fire performance standpoint, because it relied heavily on the hollow clay tile partitions that were also in the building that did not survive the earthquake very well. So the fire sort of had its way with the building. But from a structural standpoint, it's still standing. In order to retrofit the floors, what we were able to do is we were able to remove the cinders and wood sleepers and wood floor system, and we came back with a reinforced concrete topping slab, which became the new structural slab for gravity and also for the seismic forces. It was quite an elegant solution, because we didn't actually lose any floor to ceiling height by doing this. Maybe we lost about a ½ inch.
Well, in some locations we may gain ½ inch. Where we're at. Yeah.
And just to give you an idea of how weak the concrete of the floor is, included this image. This is what the floors looked like in the building after we removed the wood sleepers and the cinders. And as you can see, the contractor had quite a difficult time taking off the wood flooring without knocking holes through the existing concrete floor. Emphasizing the need for that materials investigation phase.
Exactly.
Here's another building that we worked on, a couple buildings that we worked on with BAR, buildings 101 and 103 in the Presidio. We're also currently working on building 105, which is identical in the floor plate configuration to buildings 101 and 103, and that's being repurposed into a hotel. Yeah, bread and breakfast.
Yeah, that one.
That one, exactly. And the reason why I included this particular building is I think it's a really good example of how the approach that I outlined earlier with regards to the approach to retrofitting or strengthening existing buildings really involves understanding the structural system and the structural weaknesses and the structural strengths of a particular building. These buildings actually have really good brick and mortar strength, meaning the shear strength of the brick was quite high, higher than what we expected. However, the brick piers, which are shown in this photograph off to the right, had a quite high aspect ratio. That means the height of the brick pier versus the length of the brick pier was quite high, which limited the amount of strength that the building could capitalize because of a mechanism that we call rocking. These piers in a seismic event would rock, and it will rock, and a gap will form at the top and bottom of the brick pier, and thereby really limiting the amount of seismic force that the brick pier can carry. And it doesn't really, the brick pier can't fully utilize that good shear strength that I mentioned earlier. So in order to prevent that rocking, what we did is we applied some carbon fiber strips on both sides of the pier to lock the pier in place and thereby help the building realize its full potential. I think I know that really all we had to do to this building is apply these carbon fiber strips. We had to do some foundation work because it was a rubble stone foundation. And then we added 2 concrete shear walls on the interior. I think they're about 14, 15 feet long. And that was it. And that brought the buildings up to current code standards, which is really a great way to preserve the historic fabric of the building. Actually, what's interesting here, I should point out, these white strips in between the carbon fiber strips, that's a historic plaster that we were able to leave on the piers. And then afterwards, the contractor was able to come back and then patch in, because these carbon fiber strips are just 0.04 inches in thickness, so it really doesn't take any of the usable square footage of the building up, and you're able to retain the historic moldings of the building without having to fur them out. And with that, I guess we're on to questions for discussion. Did you want to take over there, Joseph?
I will give me that authority.
So why should we consider historic buildings for hotels? Well, in the beginning, let's see. So now I'm going to try and put on my developer and financial hat. There's a couple reasons why, in addition to location and the urbanist kind of principles of locating these buildings in, historic cores where people want to go visit. They also have opportunities because they're often in distressed locations, so they come at a good price point. They also are available for tax credits. So depending on how you approach those aspects. So between those, it's a good real estate deal. And so Joseph, I don't know if you want to add to this one too, but that's why we end up getting developers coming to us to say, how do we convert this thing into a hotel?
Yeah, I'd add a couple of things. One is they're close to good transportation facilities frequently, whether it's public transportations or freeway intersections. They tend to be in good locations for transportation. So that tends to be a big key. there's also a growing segment of the population that I guess we could call the experiential traveler. And if given the choice between staying at your traditional 3 or 4 story stucco Marriott versus, let's say, another Marriott that's got kind of a story to it, even if they don't know the story, but they can visually see that it's an older hotel, and intuitively just know there's a story to it, they'd opt for the one with the story. And so I think there is a market for that traveler, and even the franchisees of these major chains are now trying to address those travelers. And I think the last thing to maybe think about is sort of from an environmental review is these are buildings that are already in place. And so from sort of a CEQA analysis, it's already a variable that's been in play. So now you're talking about frequently using it for something that's going to be a lower level of intensity in terms of traffic use and other uses that would show up in that EIR. So I think that it can give you a little bit of an edge with regards to skirting through everybody's favorite CEQA analysis. Let's see. I don't yet have authority. Oh, wait, there we go. Whoa.
Yeah.
I thought I did.
Just count to 20.
Okay. So the next question is, and this is more for the two of you, how is the overall design process for a hotel different in a historic building?
Well, I'm gonna reinforce what Dan had said and let him build on that one. But the first, most extensive, probably detailed part of the entire design process comes up front during material investigation. You really want to get into every nook and cranny of that historic building to find out what is precious, what is sacred, what is something you want to keep, and you really need to get to know it. And that's not necessarily something that you do in a normal ground up solution. And the key on that is because the more you understand this building, the more likely you can propose design solutions that will actually fit and work and not unravel as you go on. So it's almost we often have a part of the design process that we call the critical issues analysis phase. It would be kind of in the same location that you would normally do a concept phase, but we're actually getting into the detail of some of the things that we'll need to solve in the building. For example, can you put in an elevator? How do you actually do it? Does the overrun actually fit? That's a critical issue. If you can't get the elevator in, you don't have a building. So it's a detailed process way up front that we really dig into to help us understand the building. And Dan, I'm going to build on that?
Yeah, no, well, with like you just said, and what I said earlier, it's a historic building. It's really understanding what you have. But another way to think of it, just rather than talking about just structural aspects, is you have to work with the historic building to find out what works with that building. You can't just sit there and take a standard hotel and then cram it into the building. You have to figure out ways you can adjust that standard hotel mold and fit that into the building in a way that's tasteful, in a way that preserves the historic fabric of the building. I think that's really just the
essence of
it.
Right.
But it does come down to a lot of upfront work, finding out what you have, what the building's strengths are, and understanding what the building's weaknesses are.
So plan for surprises.
Plan for surprises, yeah. Yes.
Yes, there is the contingency part. And Joseph, I'd like to have you actually comment on the process of getting a historic building through the regulatory process, because that also changes the design process a bit when you're working on an historic building. We find that we have to go in very, very early to get a municipality really comfortable with how we're adapting an historic building, more so than in ground up construction.
Absolutely. It's interesting because there's not just the official government regulatory group you need to be concerned about, but there's also the preservationist group, that there's a conservation easement that functions almost like a regulatory agency. In fact, often is your first blush review when you're going to propose a change or any sort of change in use on the project. The government, in effect, has handed off that role to the regulatory agency. So getting them on board first is critically important, because then you go before the city, because the first thing the city's going to do is often look to the preservation organization and ask, what do you guys think of this? It's in your bailiwick of projects, or you're named as the holder of the conservation easement. Are you okay with this? So just like getting in there and finding out what you've got early is important. Finding out what you've got from a regulatory perspective, including sort of these non-governmental actors that are important, is really important, because if you come out of the chutes the wrong way and propose something that maybe is pushing the boundaries too far, or over believe what you've got, you could hit that first speed bump in the process and find that it's just the local preservation organization that you've completely turned off to a project that, if you had presented it in a different way or had a more constrained view of what you were hoping to do, would have been very excited about what you had. You know, happy to see you take an unused asset and made productive. So I agree with the statement that you want to get started early. I think the second thing is working with those local organizations that aren't necessarily, that are quasi-governmental, or at least have some allocated authority to sort of act as the first level. And I think understanding where that property fits in the area. I think it's looking at the historic overlay zone, if there's one there. It's what I do as an attorney is very similar to what the two of you are talking about doing. I want to know if there's a historic zone. I want to know if this is listed as a historic asset, if it's a contributing asset. I want to know why. I want to sort of understand the story of this property, because that's going to help us when we're trying to figure out how to underwrite it from a risk perspective and from a financing perspective, but also in terms of what all we can do with it. And I think in terms of what the city's interested in, the cities are very open to these. I mean, they've got these assets and they're in a little bit of a crunch, because they've got a building, it's historically designated, it's sitting there and it's vacant. And it's not producing a whole lot of tax revenue, especially when you consider what it could be producing if TOT revenue was coming out of it for hotels. And they'd like to see it converted. So I tend to find that the cities are open to it. But when there's those historic designations, you got to make sure that you've complied with that. And the best way to do it is just start early and start early and have a dialogue. I haven't found that the preservation groups have been roadblocks, but you just need to go in and understand they're a constituency, just like any other constituency when you're developing a project, and understand what their wants and needs are, and work with them to show them how this project is going to either meet those wants and needs, or how you can work with them to create something that will leave everybody happy.
I would echo that too. The preservation community is key in being able to provide some of the information and resources that allow you to do what you can do. Because we found a great deal of support there. But again, it's the reach out early and get to know not just the building itself, but the context of the building. Well,
and you know, and a good illustration for that is on one of our clients' projects. He had a building that some earlier historic surveys had indicated that it had been of historic significance to a variety of different groups, but the one that kept coming up was that it had been a common hotel for African Americans during the Depression. But they couldn't state that anybody had historically ever stayed there or had lived there long enough to really kind of push it over the edge, but it was on our radar early on by going through the surveys. And so we discussed this with my client, and we engaged with the local African American Historic Society and came to a consensus about, and they said, look, it's important, but it's not that important. And so the consensus solution was they're going to put a plaque there memorializing what this building was, and there's going to have some design elements related to it. And it left them feeling very excited about the project and sort of the recognition that was coming with this. But some of them were allies and actually showed up and spoke in favor of the project. So if you do it the right way, a preservation organization, like I said, they get very excited when they see an old building suddenly repurposed. And so I agree. But if you wait till that last minute, if you wait till the Monday before the Tuesday night planning commission meeting, it's too late.
Yeah, it's a little too late.
And I think it's important to underline just from an early engagement part of this is engaging with the historic preservation architects, just because there is often the need to go back to the drawing board and look at multiple different approaches to the same project. Yes. 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 different concepts, right, which balance the financial aspects of the financial needs of the project, carefully with the historic preservation part of it,
right,
to hopefully land at a place where the project can be realized and move forward. And just the amount of time that it takes, it can sometimes takes years to get through.
Yeah, years.
Well, the buildings is, depending on the building, sometimes the preservation organization has a better history of the building than the seller does. So I can get the seller to give us all sorts of representations and warranties about when construction was done or the condition. But if we talk to the historic community, they can actually come back and say, no, 1927, and they can give you the doc. Sometimes they have photographs and they can show you when something was added and when it wasn't. It can be a really tremendous resource in understanding what you have from our side, and I can imagine from yours as well.
Yep.
Okay.
Well, not to belabor the point, maybe we've already covered this, but wait for it to go through.
Yeah, are you pressing it or are you pressing it?
I'm
there.
How is the construction process inherently different for a hotel and a historic building?
Well, we start the list. Oh, I'm kidding. Dan and I are in the middle of a joint construction process right now, beginning, and we were just having this conversation about how it is different than a ground up process for sure. So the construction process, okay, so there's construction process for an existing building that's different than ground up. There's a construction process for an existing building that's a hotel that's different. And all historic buildings will go through, again, it's almost like exploratory demo, and then there's shoring and dealing with existing fabric, and then there's foundations and seismic work, and getting the contractor to understand what is historic fabric and what's not. With the hotel, the biggest kind of add to that is this additional team member that's the hotel operator. So you have timing and hotel operations that overlay into an historic building that is probably different than just like a ground up core and shell or a core and shell of an historic building. Yeah. So you'll do a model room, for example, where you'll test fit a lot of you actually use that model room as a kind of a dry run for construction and have you run services and piping and structures through the building. So the construction process in and of itself is modeled slightly different for an historic building and a hotel in and of itself. And Dan, I don't know if you want to add to any of that?
Yeah, well, I think the hotel aspect of the construction process does involve a lot of floor penetrations, which is what I talked about earlier. But how those floor penetrations make it into the design is usually through the MEP design build portion of the team. A lot of our teams now rely on design build MEP, and what you really need to be aware of is you need to get that contractor involved early on, and you need to get their design build team involved early on so that you can start doing the coordination that's going to be necessary to work around the existing elements of the building, whether they be just concrete beams or columns, or the historic features of the building that need to be accounted for when in the design build of those penetrations through the structure. So that's something that I would highlight as a key component to the construction process in a historic building.
Another one, I'd just like to add one more item on that, is in a hotel in particular, every piece of a hotel, all the fixtures and furnitures, all come with a certain amount of inherent invisible clearances that go all the way around them. Clearances and other types of criteria that might be invisible on a piece of paper, but are extremely important for layout. So when it comes to putting a hotel in particular in, because there's a lot of those little pieces, layout of a floor plan becomes critical. And so, because they all have clearances for, the American with Disabilities Act, or how guests get through, or operational issues. And so from a construction process, what we end up doing, we start to sound a bit like broken records with our contractor, but we will plan and spend as much time out in the field figuring out layout as they want, because it's the distances to existing historic material, preservation of pieces, those all count, all those little quarter of an inches. So that in particular is a little bit different than a normal construction process and a normal historic building rehab.
And I would just add that it's really important to hire people like Susan and Dan that understand this.
Yay.
Having talked to architects who don't deal in this area or engineers that don't deal in this area, they'll kind of look you in the eye sometimes and nod, and you don't get that sense that they are nodding in agreement, but just sort of nodding to placate you. So if you've got a historic asset, I think it's very important that you get the right people to deal with it. And you know, like Dan said, if you're drilling into floors and you're trying to figure out how to retain that which makes the building what it is, it's really important to deal with people who know what they're doing and have that appreciation for it. Because I've at least seen a number that, like I said, nod, but don't give you that sense that they're nodding in agreement.
That's right.
Yeah.
All right.
Okay.
How do lenders and investors respond to proposals to adapt historic buildings? Do either of you want to pipe in on that?
Well, we're probably a step away from the actual discussions with lenders and investors. But I do know that with the current construction lending, there's a lot more scrutiny on all kinds of things. So I do know that while there's a clear openness for wanting to restore buildings and use these buildings, both investors and lenders want a degree of comfort on how we're proceeding. So we find we're spending a lot more time both providing information as well as getting people comfortable with what we're actually doing, because it's not, most of the time what we're doing in an historic building is it's a combination of structural systems, for example, instead of one given structural system.
Yeah.
So we might end up spending more time explaining that. We might spend more time cost justifying things for people.
And I'd like to add to that, lenders frequently want to see that construction schedule and see that locked in. And usually when you get into a historic building, no matter how much due diligence you've done up front, there's going to be unanticipated obstacles that you're going to have to deal with during construction. And it also, getting to your point earlier, having experienced people on your team that are used to this and that don't fall off their chair when they, uncover an unforeseen condition, it's definitely a key part of having a successful project. One thing that I think is different for historic buildings, and it doesn't always come into play, but usually knowing what those lenders are going to want from a structural perspective at the end of the day, which is they're going to want to see that the building, and this is probably really only relevant in seismic country, but at the end of the day, there's a construction loan, there's a loan on the building, and those investors are going to want to see a probable maximum loss evaluation done. And we, as structural engineers, need to be aware that that needs to hit a particular target. So we have to educate people along the way as to what we need to do structurally so that those targets can be met, and then we don't look back and say, well, if we'd only done things differently.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's just having an experienced team is definitely good and will help with smooth things over with the investors in the lending community.
One more kind of item is investors and lenders being kind of people devoted to making sure the finances work out. One thing that both owners, lenders, and investors all want is a really firm construction cost as you move in to an historic building. And historic buildings, all of them, whether they're hotels or otherwise, require a larger contingency for things that happen during construction than a normal ground-up, much more predictable process. And so getting those lenders, investors, and owners comfortable with both preparing for that contingency, planning for it, budgeting for it, and then also allocating it is something that you have to do throughout the entire construction process.
I'd echo Dan's sentiment that as much due diligence as any buyer or developer does, count on the lender doing just as much, if not more, and same with the investors. And so build that into your letter of intent when it comes time to buy, and your financing and timing contingencies, and expect that they're going to bug bug Dan or whoever you've hired to, kind of size up the property. But there is an opportunity, I think. I always think of development as sort of a story, and when you're pitching it to lenders and investors, you're pitching a story, and that's why you pay people like Susan to draw these beautiful pictures and graphic representations of what this is going to look like when it's done. When the building's already there, you've got a little bit of an edge, because you've got a structure that already exists, and it may be run down, it may be tired and need of love, but you do have that building. So I think you can leverage, this is already here, and here's what we're going to do to it, and here's what we're going to do with it, and here's what it can be. And so I think in terms of taking that story to investors and taking it to your lenders, I think it gives you a little bit of an edge there.
Yeah.
All right. Next question. Oop, that went too quick. Go back. All right. What is the greatest challenge in convincing a franchisor to approve the selection of a historic building to carry their flag?
The greatest challenge. Well, of course, the greatest challenge with any franchisor about any new building is, will it reinforce their brand? So, they're very concerned about what their brand is like and the guest experience that carries along with the brand. And so if you start with that as the main kind of challenge of talking to any franchisor, then the question is how does that historic building either support or, dare I say, compromise or get their brand to adapt? Mm-hmm. So we are finding that the best historic hotels, meaning hotels and historic buildings that have been repurposed as opposed to just the outright historic hotel, like the Palace Hotel here in San Francisco, is finding a franchisor who is really willing and wants to work with the existing material to localize their product, that their brand has a local component that they really want to make present, and that their brand is actually part and parcel with adapting to an existing situation. So the franchisors that are a little more edgy, a little less wrote in their packages, or a little more flexible, are the ones that tend to be more drawn to historic buildings and eager to do that.
I echo that sentiment. You can't work with an entity that's going to try and force fit a square peg to a round hole.
Right.
You can't. You have to be able to willing to adapt the mold to the building rather than the building to the mold.
Right.
And without that, it's going to be an uphill battle.
And there's lots of really great examples of people who have that kind of mental attitude of, I just really want to make this thing an amazing, hotel.
Yeah.
And so there's some great franchisors out there who really like doing this.
Right. And it's been my experience that there's the negotiables and there's the non-negotiables when you're talking to them. The non-negotiables are the life safety.
Right.
Yeah. There's too much liability associated if you're a Hilton brand hotel with somebody getting caught in a fire and you having 100-year-old escape routes. But the negotiable side is things, they've got, if you read them, they seem insane, but I know that there's a reason for it. But, the bathtub has to be so far from the sink, from the toilet, from the bed to the door. And they're very particular about that on new construction. Some franchisors, though, when you present them with a historic building, will yield and let you go, 13 inches, from sink to door instead of, 15 or whatever the standard is. So bear that in mind when you're working with them, is one, pick people that are open to the idea, but know that there are the things that you're going to push on and be able to maybe get some care even than the issues that they're just never going to bend on. Those usually are the life safety issues. And as Susan said, the ones that are going to really diminish their brand.
The other thing that is really somewhat of a challenge is key count. Is most operators, franchisors, have kind of plateaus of key count that they aim for to provide certain amenities and certain kind of guest experiences. And historic buildings, with their footprints, you sometimes can hit those key counts and sometimes you can't. And, it just is one of those things that you have to, again, negotiate and make sure that you're providing the right guest experience for the right number and the right amenities.
Absolutely. Press the button. There we go.
Okay.
What are your thoughts on the various tax devices available and how do these drive your decisions?
Well, I'll start this one because in our last webinar, our seminar when we had this at the Presidio, this was a topic of great debate. There are all kinds of tax devices available for historic buildings, both from a statewide level and a federal level, even at a local level. And so, you know, to not keep sounding like a broken record again, it's knowing what those are first and which ones you're going after. And if those tax devices are critical for the financing of the building, because they will determine what you say and what you don't say, where you do things, where you don't tear out interior finishes. Each tax device has criteria that states that preservation is important for this, that, and the other thing, and that is just one more criteria that will bound your decisions. And it may be everything from where does the back of the house actually come in, where's the entry to the building, might be an important preservation criteria, to energy efficiency. Do you keep your windows? Do you not keep your windows? So we really encourage the owners that we're working with to spend time up front during the concept phases discovering what tax incentives are available and which ones they plan to pursue, because those will end up becoming a grounding. We will be out in the field saying, no, we need to keep this material for our tax credit. It'll drive all the way down through construction.
Yeah.
No, I completely agree with Susan on everything she just said. If we don't, it's really important early on to understand which tax credits you absolutely need to make the project economically viable and move forward, and which ones are nice to haves and we can chase. Obviously you want all of them, but then when it comes down to it, what do you absolutely need to have to make this project move forward? Because there might be other things that you might not be willing to give up, like the key count, for example. If you have to lose 10 rooms, but you get $1 million in tax credits, it may not be worth it to the building owner because or to the entity, because the 10 keys are worth more than that, and it's important to understand that.
Yeah, and we've got some great examples of that on a recent project. Dan and I were working on a historic office building. It's got interior hollow clay tile walls, the corridor and transoms that we would have to save in order to get tax credits because they're intact, they're part of the interior material. But saving those adds too much structure and space on the inside, and suddenly the rooms aren't viable. It's actually really.
That was how many millions of dollars was that question?
That was like an $8 million question.
That was an $8 million question.
Just that question alone. And so we spent a lot of time with the National Park Service talking about that solution, looking at different viable solutions, and looking at the actual rooms to see if we could actually, if this was really basically a thing that we could do or not.
Yeah. Yeah, my experience as a part-time tax lawyer is this is not something that usually moves the needle with clients. They usually want the project to be able to stand on its own. Not all of them, but a fair number of them. But when you come to them after the acquisition and you say, look, can we now talk about these tax credits? They become very excited as a sort of a way to plus up the project and increase their internal rate of return. And hotels are really good candidates for this because a lot of these devices, such as the Mills Act and conservation easements, have a public access requirement. You can't just take the tax credits and never let the public get the public benefit from them. So hotels with their lobbies work really, really well for this. So when I do the due diligence on a building for a client, I'm always looking for 4 things, and those are: first, is the availability of the Mills Act there? Does it already have a contract? Does the city have enabling legislation so that we could enter into a Mills Act contract with the city? Second is, what's the eligibility for the rehabilitation tax credits under Section 47 of the Internal Revenue Code? And like Susan said, have we coordinated our design efforts with them so that we're going to be eligible for them? The next is there eligibility to put a conservation easement on the property? Once we get it built and restored, could we put a conservation easement on there and take a charitable deduction for them? And then finally, is there transferable development rights associated with this property? Which in San Francisco, some of the historic zones, you get air rights that you can sell. And if you do structure it as part of a like-kind exchange under Internal Revenue Code Section 1031, you could take several $100,000 or however much you can value your air rights and sell them for no taxable gain as long as you roll that into the acquisition of a qualifying replacement property. So it can be a hard sell with clients up front, but once they're locked into the property, it can very often get them excited about the opportunities.
Right.
So, Susan and Dan, how do conservation easements affect the design process?
To be honest, I haven't worked with a conservation easement before, so Joseph, I would love to hear your thoughts.
Well, this question actually was posed based upon a property that Sajid and I went and checked out when we were up there for CPF. And sort of the answer was, is you build around it. Sometimes they're really, I mean, sometimes they're great. Sometimes you get a conservation easement and it's a beautiful piece of external art on the building. It's a clock in the middle of the lobby of an office building that's historic, and you would never think about ripping that out. But we actually looked at a building that had the clock, and that was great. But one of the historic aspects of the building that was covered by the easement was, I forgot what the exact word is, but it was all the wood design elements in there, because it had all the counters that were in there for where the public would come in and pay bills, because the ground floor of this office building was where the public would come to pay their bills, and those were covered because they were 100-year-old or so, and they're beautiful. But it's not like what you would expect in a normal hotel, is that you'd walk in there and there'd be these like old-fashioned bank teller windows. You just work around them. Like, I don't know if there's a better answer than that. But you need really creative architects when you get to that.
Yeah, this is the question of how do you turn this interesting thing into a beautiful, amazing amenity. You know, that's kind of part of the creative process.
Well, that's what happens. You know, some of those maybe become concierge area. Some of them become the check-in. I mean, you just, like you said earlier, it's like playing Tetris. And so you know you have these needs when you're opening and operating a hotel, and then you have these constraints. And can you fit the two together there?
Well, and to be honest, if there's a conservation easement on this thing, it's probably because it's unusual, different, and has a great story. And so, again, that's something that the operator will want to capitalize on. You know, whether it's a bank and it's got the old teller things, or it's a bank vault, or, you know, an old cistern, or, you know, you name it. It's usually you want to figure out how to highlight it.
Right.
That's the part.
All right, next question. What are the challenges you face when dealing with historic preservation organizations in the development process?
Well, I'll start on this one. Having worked with the Presidio Trust, having worked with local communities, having worked with preservation architects, the challenge is really getting the dialogue and the conversation to flesh out all the issues so that you can come to a resolution. Most of the historic preservation organizations that we talked a little bit about the resources they bring and the opinions and the solutions that they often provide. And so I've never had an issue of not welcoming an historic preservation organization into the development process. So the key on that is usually within the organizations themselves, bless us all, we don't always have a common voice. You know, people understand that we need density. People understand that we want to protect a historic building. And so, for example, when you end up with a very low density historic building that has a great facade and wanting to just keep that facade, something the preservationists call facadism, you know, how do you go through the development process and satisfy everybody? So the challenge is usually one of, I guess, dialogue and laying out the criteria that you have to have, laying out the goals that everyone has on the table. It's a great kind of mediated, facilitated, negotiated process, is what we find up front. I'm looking at Dan. Well, next.
Well, I mean, I can add to that from from a structural standpoint, it's something that, well, structural engineers, we struggle with this to begin with, even if the building wasn't historic. But when you're trying to communicate with a lot of times non-technical people from very complicated structural engineering concepts and design issues, then it's really about communication and how much time you need to spend to really outline every single different concept or option that you've considered to solve the same problem, which is the project. And then making the historic preservation organization, whether it's the City of Trust or the National Park Service, yeah, exactly.
Or a local organization that's
Historic Review Board, yeah.
Yeah, or a neighborhood organization.
You just have to be able to articulate yourself in a way that they can understand. And sometimes it's really successful, and other times less so.
Sometimes it just takes a little bit more work and illustration and, anything. One of the things that the challenges that we do face with historic preservation issues in general is in an historic building, inevitably, especially with a hotel, I think interior finishes in particular may not be something that can be, saved due to the fact you have to put in a big shear wall. The fact that you have to, input a certain amount of rooms. And so having to maintain the integrity is probably the biggest kind of key word that we will spend talking about, because even within the preservation community, the kind of understanding of what is integrity is something that we have to debate. I mean, we just, how much can we take away before integrity is lost? How much is remaining that still can claim to have integrity?
Yeah, my experience is it's really more a client side problem than a preservation organization side problem. And it's getting that client who's dealing with a historic asset for the first time to understand that this property has an additional stakeholder involved. And it's not the seller, and it's not the tenants, it's not the franchisor you're talking to, your lender. It's an often unseen group that they don't know, they can't identify the same way, who has a vested interest in this property. And understanding that they need to engage with them, like we talked earlier, ideally during the due diligence process, because if you're going to underwrite this building based upon assumptions, those assumptions should include the ideas and the requests and the obligations that the preservation organization is going to put forth once you close on it. So it's better to come forward now before you're committed to buying the property and doing what you plan to do with it, knowing what that stakeholder is going to require in order for them to not oppose the transaction. Because if they come through and they tell you that there's an additional $500,000 workaround that you're going to have to build in order to maintain the integrity of the asset, it's better to know it before you close, when you can either go to your lender or your investor and get that increase in your budget, or you can figure out if the deal even makes sense. Then to close, then find out you've got an issue because the historic preservation organizations are not going to let you do what you want to do with the problem. And like I said, that's not an organizational issue, that's a client issue, and getting them to understand the kind of due diligence and the planning that they need to do ahead of time when buying a historic asset.
Right.
All right, I think this takes us to our last official question, and that's how does the furniture, fixtures, and equipment design and the design coordination process differ for a historic building?
Well, we've said it a couple times during the course of this. You have to like those sliding puzzles in Tetris. If you just stated that when you were developing the design team, do you like these things? That alone would be able to make the cut. Because FF&E design, which is furniture, fixtures, and equipment, for those of you out there, it's the little pieces that go in to make everything comfortable and work. Your bed, your bathtub, your desk, your copier in the admin area, and all of those pieces have to, when you have an existing condition, you can't just put them in kind of standard routine ways. And you have to convince your plumber that, no, the sink has to go in this particular location, because really, honestly, you're going to have to avoid that being three floors down. Yeah. So we really want to put this over here now to begin with. So it really, you have to really be almost overly communicative and really, really interested in making sure that this is resolved. It has to be almost like a sense of pride to make it all resolved. And that's what's different about, I think, an historic building as opposed to simply implementing, a brand kind of organized package. Dan's like, yeah. How many times have I had to do stuff just because the brand says we have to have this? Joseph, I don't know if you want to add to that too.
Well, one of the issues that came up when we asked this back in April, which I thought was interesting, was the cost. If I'm building a 150-room, ground up, kind of your generic franchise hotel, I'm going to order 150 of the same bed, the same desk, the same dresser, same shelf, and there's some cost savings to that. Even if I have to have the items specially made for my hotel, there's significant cost savings if I'm getting 150 of the same thing made. If you look back at that design, that overlay that Susan and Dan put up of the project they were talking about, those rooms were not all the same size. They were not all the same shape.
Yeah.
And so you can't order 150 of the same bed because 150 those rooms are not going to fit the same bed. So this is really where you get into sort of a Tetris buying mode. Is you need 37 desks of one shape and 62 of another. And then you need 3 that are custom because they're going around support beams. So it can be a much more expensive proposition because you're not getting the same efficiencies for building out the same volume of
it takes an entire effort to build on that. You're absolutely right. It's not as efficient. We're in the middle of that exercise right now, and I literally am counting. I think it's types of different wardrobe pieces, and this one has to be 4 inches smaller than that one for this reason, and yeah, it'll drive your purchasing agent and your manufacturer and your architect or interior designer nuts for a while, but getting it right also is kind of important. Just knowing that you have to spend that extra time is really important.
Yeah. So John, that takes us to the end of our questions, so looking at the clock, probably should open it up for the Q&A.
Great. Yeah. So just a reminder to everybody in the room, there's 2 buttons on the top left of your screen that you can ask a question through. You can use the Q&A box or use the chat box. We'll open it up to questions now. And just to get the ball rolling, I don't see any questions currently. But to start, I think I'll have a question on my end. And that was in relation to the financial incentives. I know you talked a little bit about the Mills Act, Joseph, and I did a quick Google search. I guess the Mills Act was actually sort of introduced by Jim Mills because of a hotel. It was the Coronado Hotel in San Diego.
That's right. Yeah.
So I'm wondering, I guess the question I have is, how common is it to bundle different types of financial incentives together, like the tax credit and the Mills Act, and say a conservation easement into one project?
If I had a say, it would happen. It's like I said, I think it's an easy sell if you've got the client there. And they're going to rehab the property. It's a slam dunk. It's you're going to make the money back. I did a presentation on this in 2015 for CPF on the tax benefits with an accountant. We walked through all the numbers, and each of the analogy we use is each one of these individual things you do is like hitting a single in baseball. But if you hit enough singles, you're going to start getting runs, and they add up. The challenge is when you got the client who's bought a historic asset, they're very excited about it, and then you sit down to them and start to tell them about the constraints. And if they're not creative or they're not committed to preservation, they'll start to see this as money that's too hard to earn, and they'll pass on it.
Yeah.
And you'll sit there and you sometimes feel like you're pleading with them, but if we just do this, and you can see them because you're already talking about taxes, which they're not really excited about talking about. And now you're talking to them about the constraints you're going to put on their design team and on how they could, some of the things they can do with the property. And if it's not the right person, they're going to walk from it. But if you've got the right person and they've got the right mindset about it, they're a slam dunk. I don't know why you wouldn't do it. How common that is? I don't know. In my experience, I've seen both.
Okay. And maybe in relation to that, have you heard of the 10% credit being used for supposedly non-historic buildings, but buildings that date before 1936?
Yes. So that's still under Section 47. That's just the lower threshold. It's buildings that are old enough but haven't met the higher threshold required for the 20%.
Okay.
Otherwise, it's all the same requirements in terms of substantiation and what you can get the deductibility for.
Okay. And while we're waiting for questions here, I actually typed in, or I pasted into the chat box a link to the survey for today's, the evaluation for today's webinar. So if you can visit that link while we're asking and going through these questions and respond to the survey so that we can collect your responses. Maybe a second question in relation to the structural kind of limitations of some of these structures. And I guess this question is for Dan. For the carbon fiber sort of reinforcements that you did with the Presidio project, is that typically a relatively expensive kind of addition, or does it add a lot of cost to the project? I mean, I would assume it would.
That's actually a really good question. Well, initially, we took on the design of these particular buildings after another engineer had retrofitted the building in between the two, right? 102. Yeah.
Yes.
And building 102 is right in the middle. And the approach to the retrofit on that building,
104 for sure.
was concrete shear wall.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
So rather than doing the FRP solution, was shotcrete on the inside face of every single wall in the building. So basically build a concrete building within the existing building, which you might imagine involved losing quite a bit of usable square footage out of the building, and then redoing all of the historic molding around the windows and doors. The same contractor that we worked with on buildings 101 and 103 had done this other retrofit using the concrete approach, and the FRP was actually less expensive. So not only was it less intrusive and a more intelligent, like, I wouldn't say more intelligent, just a more focused approach at focusing just on the weakness of the historic structure. It also proved to be less expensive. So it's worthwhile spending the time to investigate these different types of approaches to retrofitting and reusing the archaic materials. And we are big advocates of performance-based engineering, which is something that we outlined in the structural design process as one of the decisions that you have to make. And it's important to be able to talk to your clients, in this case it was trust, and convince them that it's worthwhile paying your engineers a little bit more money than you ordinarily would in order to do the dynamic analysis and come up with lighter touch structural solutions like the one that we showed for building 101 and 103 and now also building 105. So yeah. Hope that answers your question.
Sure. Yeah, that was a good answer. Thank you. The other question I had was about, we just had a workshop in Los Angeles that approached the California Historical Building Code. And knowing what you said about life safety considerations and hotels, which may be a bit more stringent than they would be in a different type of building. And then things like accessibility, which are probably, hotels being concerned about lawsuits and things like that. I'm assuming they'd be really stringent on that. Do you still apply the California Historical Building Code when possible, or do you meet those higher thresholds to the code?
Well, we definitely meet, I'll speak toward the accessibility thing because I've spent a lot of time with the San Francisco Building Department applying the California Historic Building Code in the hotel that we're doing in terms of coming up with arguments for reasonable equivalencies is we're not trying to get around providing accessibility. We're trying to make sure that we're meeting the codes in maybe a way that wasn't anticipated by the people who wrote the code. And it could be anywhere from, say, a clear, unobstructed distance away from a fixture, like I'm dealing with that right now in the California Plumbing Code, applying the Historic Building Code to allow us to figure out how to put hardware on doors to make sure that the clearances are done right in kind of an unusual way, to adapting the building from an accessibility standpoint, where we go in and we're really showing how the whole building works and we're providing accessibility that is equivalent, but maybe not. How do you provide equivalence to every room type when every room is different? You know, so again, it takes a little bit more time and work and savviness, knowing both how the Historic Building Code lets you work through equivalencies and work to equivalencies versus meeting kind of the letter of the code, you know, as it stands.
Yes, I agree with that. I think the Historic Building Code is a tool that we can use, and within that tool, it provides you certain allowances with regards to relaxing some of the prescriptive language that's in the building code. And that's the big issue that as structural engineers we have with the building code, is that it's prescriptive. This is what you need to do in this situation, regardless of what you're dealing with. And that's where the performance-based approach you can prove equivalence to the building code, but you haven't necessarily ticked all the boxes of the prescriptive requirements that are in the building code. And the state historic building code recognizes that and gives us those tools.
Yeah, it does. It states right out there that you're allowed to present something for consideration, which I have found very useful and important in working with historic buildings.
Great, and I'm keeping an eye on the chat box here. I don't see any questions come in, so I'm going to give one last chance to our participants, to our 5 participants today, to ask any questions. And of course, if you'd like, just send me your questions if you think of anything later, and I'll make sure that the speakers get them and are able to answer them by email if they're able to. So with that being said, I'm going to remind you to please take the survey that is in the chat box, and to pull that up, you just click on the chat button on the top left-hand side of your screen, and there's a link to a survey there, and please take that so we know how we did and what kind of programs you want to see in the future. I wanted to thank Susan, Dan, and Joseph today for their time. Really appreciate it. I missed the conference session, so I'm really glad I made it this time and was able to see your presentations. I hope we see you speak more for us in the future. With that, I'm going to turn off the webinar, but I'm just going to turn off the sound and leave that link up for about 10 minutes here, so it gives you plenty of time to take that survey. Thanks again to our speakers, and have a wonderful day, and look forward to seeing you at more future events.
Thanks, John.
Do I just say yes?